When Massachusetts voted to legalize recreational marijuana, we also voted to establish the country's first ever statewide pot shop equity program. The goal was to make sure the new industry benefited the same communities, mostly those of color, that were disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs, arrested at higher rates than their white neighbors. But more than 3 years later, there's not a whole lot to show for it. State's Cannabis Control Commission only just recently granted its first final license to a member of the so-called Economic Empowerment Program, which was intended to give priority application status to members of those communities. Only after first approving 114 other shops outside of the program, 37 of which are already up and running. So, what went wrong, and is it fixable? I'm joined now by a member of that commission, Shaleen Title, who also co-authored the ballot question that brought us legal marijuana and a promise of social equity in the first place. Shaleen, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for being here. So 3+ years since the voters approved this thing, 2+ years since your commission is in place. Is it fair to say that the efforts to implement this program have been a near total failure?
No, I don't think it's fair to say that.
Why not?
Well, I think if you look at the first states, Colorado, Washington, and others that legalized cannabis, they were figuring things out along the way as well. We were the first state to try to do equity.
Well, the statute's fabulous, and you deserve a lot of praise for it, but writing it and doing it obviously are two very different animals,
absolutely
right?
Two different things. But what we have done over the past 2.5 years is collect data, be transparent and honest about what we're trying and how it's working, and take an input from these communities we're trying to benefit and address them along the way.
So am I right that Pure Oasis, as Kobe Evans thinks, he's been here before, was the first, though, economic empowerment operation to get a final license? Is that not correct?
It was. There's a social equity program participant that was actually the first general applicant that was issued a license in Uxbridge.
Why has this taken so long?
Which part?
Well, I mean, why has it taken us long to be able to honor the promise that your language and the voters demanded to people of color and, as I said, communities that were disproportionately harmed by these laws?
Well, because there's no manual, there's no handbook for how to figure it out. There were no instructions for how to do it. But our commission has been taking this input, and over time we've also been in touch with municipal officials and members of the legislature about how we can do this collaboratively.
Yeah, that's what I want to talk about. I hope I get this right, and I know you'll correct me if I'm wrong. The commission, by statute, is required to ensure that those disproportionately harmed by prohibition are included. But the municipalities that negotiate these local agreements, which you have called a shakedown in one case, and the U.S. Attorney, Andrew Lelling, is investigating, and obviously there was one mayor that's already in big trouble in Fall River. They're not under the same. So that imbalance seems to make your job at the commission almost impossible. You have control over only what you have control of. So how do you deal with these local communities, essentially, for the most part, with some wonderful exceptions, not giving a damn about this?
So you have highlighted the fundamental inconsistency here, which is that the state has to equitably implement this law, but every business must have some form of local approval, and cities and towns don't have to be equitable in the way that they implement the law. As you mentioned, some have really gone out of their way. Boston, Uxbridge, Brookline is directing over 1/3 of its tax revenue to minority-owned companies. But I do think that inconsistency needs to be addressed before we see widespread success.
Well, by the way, in Cambridge, my hometown, attempted to do it sort of through the back door, and a judge ruled that what they were trying to do, sort of holding off the medical marijuana shops from bidding for the recreational ones, at least in the short term, they couldn't do, right? So they've
appealed. That's ongoing. Right. That's a pending.
So what are you doing about that imbalance between local communities not having to consider what you are required to consider? What are you doing about it?
Well, one is just being partners with municipalities and offering to give them tools and resources so that they can be more equitable if they want to. But secondly, our chairman and executive director actually wrote a letter today to the legislature. Today as part of the ongoing dialogue that we've been having with the legislature about how we can do this collaboratively, suggesting that we may want to have cities and towns have the same requirement that we do, which is to figure out how to include these communities in whatever way is right for them.
Other than the fact that the legislature gives cities and towns almost whatever they want because they're very powerful and they're nervous about the people back home, is there any argument on the merits that they shouldn't be subject to the exact same rules of the road that the commission is?
I don't think so. I think if we were suggesting some hard ratio or quota, we could argue, that's not right for every city or town. But that's not the suggestion.
Do you have
the
any
suggestion is there's a lot of different things that equity could look like.
Any indication they're going to do this?
We'll have to see, but I will say I've felt very supported by the legislature. I mean, of course, it was in the original statute, and we've gotten a lot of helpful support and questions. What have we learned over the past 2.5 years? We've published studies. We've gotten input from applicants. How can we directly address those?
Let me give you a little more input. You've probably heard this. Kobe Evans has been here a couple of times, the guy from behind Pure Oasis, which we talked about. When he was here in April, we were talking about these local agreements and the problems, not the problems about them violating the law, which they appear to be doing, at least the spirit, if not the letter of the law. But here's a suggestion that Kobe Evans had to make. Here he is.
Economic empowerment applicants should not be required to have a host agreement, period.
Isn't that one way to deal with this, too? Take the locals out of this thing. If they find a spot, then no host agreement has to be negotiated to begin with. No shakedown, to use your word yet again. Isn't that another way to go with this as well?
So that suggestion is actually in the bill that
the
legislature is considering, and that the House passed, that municipalities would have the option to waive those agreements.
So delivery services. I mean, so one of the problems beyond the statute is getting capital. I mean, even if it turns out you were advancing a lot of these things, everything was working as your statute was intended, this is capital-intensive stuff. Delivery services require a lot less capital, which means that lower-income people, not big marijuana, has a far better chance of getting in. Where does that stand?
So two different things that need to be done. One is I think it's on us as the commission to make sure that we have low capital opportunities, and part of that is creating delivery services. And what we did was the first 2 years, they will be exclusively for people from these communities.
So when's that happening?
So that application is coming out in the next few months. The regulations are already passed, yes. But also what we need is a way for the companies to get the capital that they do need, which is why in the letter today the chairman and executive director suggested a loan fund similar to
created
what
by
Illinois has. Yes,
and Illinois has it, you just said.
Yes.
Can we discuss one other inequity that I was totally unaware of before reading the Globe the other day? I'm sure you knew about it. Another promise broken, at least from my estimation. The notion is that excess proceeds after, from taxes and fees, after the cost of regulation is covered, are supposed to go to a handful of things. And one of those things, the 5 potential recipients, are communities hardest hit by the war on drugs. I assume you know the answer to this question. I didn't. How much of that $67 million has gone to communities hardest hit by the war on drugs?
We don't know.
0 is what the Boston Globe says. How is that I know that's a legislative thing. How is that even remotely? Is that not at least violating the spirit of this legislation?
Well, I'm empathetic to the fact that it takes a while to implement these things. But what I would suggest is that if the legislature does take the suggestion to create a loan fund like Illinois', that's a very direct, efficient way to satisfy this requirement in the statute of directing money to those communities.
If you're a minority would-be entrepreneur watching the show who read the language that you co-wrote years ago and had their hopes raised and now says, I don't believe any of this. I don't mean you personally, but they haven't delivered on their promise. What do you say to that person?
I would say that if you look at the past 2.5 years, you have watched the way that we've taken the input and suggestions, and specifically the challenges that they've raised, the HCAs, the local approval, the lack of capital, and you can watch the way we've tried to address those barriers, and now there are bills in place that might address them. So I would say keep it up. We're very early on. No Boston store has even opened yet. It's way too early to give up.
Shailene Title, thanks so much for your time. And if you care about this, call your legislator.